Shavua Tov Rabotai, we are continuing with our Mishna Yomi. We begin today a new Mesechet, Mishnayot Mesechet Sukkah. We begin with Perek Aleph, Mishnah Aleph. Today's Mishnayot should be Leilun Nishmat, Neria ben Svetlana, Aranbayev, and Alayev ben Burcha Israelov, Menuchatam beGan Eden, Amen. The Torah commands us to eat and sleep in a sukkah, which is a structure that has walls and a special roof called tzchach during the festival of Sukkot. The next two chapters define the requirements for the walls and tzchach of a sukkah. The Mishnah begins, Sukkah shi gvoa lemala me'isrim ama psula. A sukkah whose tzchach is more than 20 amot above the ground is invalid, meaning there are more than 20 amot from the floor of the sukkah to the bottom of the tzchach. There are various opinions regarding the length of an amah, ranging between 18.9 and 22.7 inches. Since a sukkah of such great height, 20 amot which would be 20 times 18.9 or 22.7 inches, since such a sukkah of such great height cannot stand unless its structure is strong and long-lasting, it is invalid because the Torah requires a sukkah to be temporary, meaning it must be of such a size that it can be built in a temporary manner. Now the Torah in Sefer Vayikra, chapter 23, pasuk 42 says, "You shall dwell in sukkahs for 7 days," which is interpreted as teaching that a sukkah must be built to last only 7 days. Now this cannot mean that the sukkah must be built in such a way that it will fall down after exactly 7 days, because it is impossible to predict how long a particular structure will stand. Instead, the Torah is teaching that the size of a sukkah must be such that it can be built with makeshift walls and support that will last only 7 days. So for this reason, a sukkah higher than 20 amot is not valid, because a sukkah of that height requires walls and supports of a much more permanent nature. On the other hand, a sukkah lower than 20 amot, for which a 7-day structure suffices, is valid even if it is built with walls and supports that are permanent. Rabbi Yehuda machshir, but Rabbi Yehuda rules that it is valid because he holds that such a sukkah must be a permanent structure, and there is no limit to its height. The Rav does tell us, Rabbi Yehuda, the halacha does not follow the opinion of Rabbi Yehuda. Now the first Tana resumes listing types of sukkahs that are invalid. V'she'enach givua asara tfachim, any sukkah that is not 10 tfachim high, meaning there are less than 10 tfachim from the floor of the sukkah to the bottom of the tzchach. Because the Torah commands us to dwell in the sukkah, a sukkah is valid only if a person can use it like a regular dwelling. The Rav explains a sukkah less than 10 tefachim high is therefore unacceptable, since people do not live in such small spaces. Now a tefach is 1/6 of an amah, and the opinions regarding the length of a tefach range approximately from 3.2 to 3.8 inches. So multiply that by 10, that is the minimum height. V'she'en la shalosh defanot, and one that does not have 3 walls. Now the Gemara on page 6b derives some verses in the Torah that a sukkah must have at least 3 walls. However, not all the walls are subject to the same requirements. The basic rule is that the minimum width of a sukkah wall is 7 tefachim, but only 2 of the 3 walls need actually be that wide, while the third can be narrower. So for example, if 2 of the walls are 7 tefachim wide or more, and they are positioned at right angles to each other, the third wall only needs to consist of a board slightly wider than 1 tefach. This board must be placed a little less than 3 tefachim away from one of the other walls, so that the gap can be considered closed, which we're going to learn. The rule of Lavut states that a gap of less than 3 tefachim between 2 solid objects is viewed as though it were solid itself. Therefore, the board together with the gap forms a wall that is 4 tefachim wide, which suffices for the third wall according to biblical law. Now the rabbis decreed, however, that the narrow wall must be extended another 3 tefachim to complete the minimum 7 tefachim by means of a tzurat petach, a frame of a doorway. Now, this is accomplished by placing a vertical pole at least 3 tefachim away from the 1 tefach board, and placing a horizontal pole from the top of the vertical pole to the top of the board, forming the shape of a doorway. The shape framed by the door is considered part of the wall, thereby completing the 7 tefachim. Whoever can see in diagram A brought down the article Seder notes can visualize how the commentators explain it. Now this arrangement suffices only when the 2 wide walls are at right angles to each other. If they are parallel to each other, the third narrow wall must include a board somewhat wider than 4 tefachim placed within 3 tefachim of one of the wide walls. since the gap is narrower than 3 tfachim, the gap becomes part of the third wall according to the rule of lavud, therefore extending the wall to the required width of 7 tfachim. Again, whoever can see diagram B, brought down in the notes, will visualize again how the Rav is explaining the Mishnah. This was all brought down in the commentary of the Rav in his explanation to the Mishnah. And one whose sunlight is greater than its shade, meaning the sunlight area on the floor of the sukkah is larger than the shadows formed by the schach when the sun is directly overhead. Bisula. Each of these sukkahs is invalid. Now the Mishnah implies that if the sunlight areas and shadows would be equal, the sukkah would be valid because a ray of light widens slightly after going through a hole. Therefore, if the sunlit areas and shadows on the floor would be equal, the solid schach material on the top of the sukkah must be larger than the open space, because if they were equal on top, there would be more light and shade on the bottom. Since the top of the schach of the sukkah has more solid schach than empty space, the sukkah is valid. Again, this is the explanation of the Rav. The Mishnah now cites a dispute as to whether one must build a sukkah with intent to use it for the mitzvah of living in the sukkah on Sukkot. Now this refers specifically to putting the schach in place on top of the walls. The schach we know is the main part of the sukkah. In fact, the word sukkah is derived from the word schach. So the Mishnah says sukkah yeshana, in the case of an old sukkah, a sukkah that a person made long before Sukkot, which he presumably built without intending to use it for the mitzvah, Bet Shammai poslim. Bet Shammai ruled that it is invalid because the sukkah must be built for the sake of the mitzvah. But Bet Hillel ruled that it is valid because they hold that such intent is not necessary. So what is the definition of an old sukkah? It is any sukkah that one made more than 30 days before the holiday of Sukkot. Since people are not yet thinking about the holiday at that time, one who built a sukkah then presumably did not intend to use it for the mitzvah. However, if one made a sukkah less than 30 days before Sukkot, Bet Shammai agree that it is valid, because we must start studying the laws of a holiday 30 days before it begins, as the Gemara says in Pesachim 6a. People reflect upon the festivals and mitzvot during that period. Therefore, one who built a sukkah then probably intended to use it for the mitzvah, even if he did not say so explicitly. But in any event, Bet Hillel ruled that it is valid, even if he built it before 30 days from the holiday, because they hold that such intent is not necessary. However, if one did make it for the sake of using it during the festival, Bet Shammai agreed that even if he built it at the beginning of the year, soon after the previous Sukkot, it is valid since it was built with the required intent. And that is in Mishnah Aleph. Mishnah Bet now discusses the laws of a sukkah that is covered. How it says Sukkatot tachat ha'olan. If one makes a sukkah under the branches of a tree, kilu asa betoch habayit, it is as if he made it inside a house. Just as a sukkah built inside a house is not valid because it is covered, so is one built under the branches of a tree. Now it is derived from a verse in the Torah that a sukkah may not be covered. So here the Mishnah speaks of a sukkah that is covered with something that is unfit to be used as schach. The branches of a tree are unfit for schach because they are attached to the ground, and the roof of the house is unfit for the reason that we're going to see in Mishnah 6, Bli Neder B'ezrat Hashem. Now instead of saying simply that a sukkah under a tree is invalid, the Mishnah compares it to one inside a house. This is because the Mishnah wants to teach that a sukkah under a tree is disqualified only if the tree resembles a house in that its shade is greater than its light. But if the tree's light is greater than its shade, the sukkah is possibly valid, like we're going to see B'ezrat Hashem Bli Neder in Mishnah 4. Sukkah ad gabe sukkah. If one sukkah is built on top of another sukkah, such that the schach of the bottom sukkah serves as the floor of the top one, the upper sukkah is valid, but the bottom sukkah is invalid because the Torah disqualifies a sukkah that is beneath another sukkah, even though the upper sukkah has valid schach. Similar to a sukkah beneath an invalid schach, such as a tree or house, a sukkah beneath another sukkah is also disqualified, even though the upper sukkah has valid schach. However, this law applies only where the upper sukkah is truly a sukkah. If it has proper schach but is invalid for some other reason, for example, it is less than 10 tefachim high, or does not have the necessary number of walls, it does not disqualify the lower one. Rabbi Yehuda says, Im en diyurin b'aluna tachtona kshera. If there are no people living in the upper sukkah is not fit to be lived in, and therefore is not considered a sukkah. The bottom sukkah is valid because it is covered only by valid schach and not by another sukkah. For instance, if the floor of the upper sukkah, which is the schach of the lower one, is not strong enough to support blankets and pillows, the upper level cannot be called a sukkah because it is unfit to be lived in. Even if it can support a person, it is considered unfit if it cannot support his bedding as well. Since the upper level is not a sukkah, the disqualification of a sukkah and the sukkah does not apply, and the lower sukkah is valid. Now the Tana Kama agrees that if the upper floor cannot support pillows and blankets at all, it is an invalid sukkah, which does not disqualify the lower one. The dispute, the machloket between the Tana Kama and the opinion of Rabbi Yehuda is limited to where the upper floor can support pillows and blankets, but only barely. For example, it sways under their weight. According to the Tana Kama, such a sukkah is valid, so it disqualifies the lower sukkah. According to Rabbi Yehuda, it is not valid, and therefore does not affect the lower one. Now, this dispute between the Tana Kama and Rabbi Yehuda is based on the same principles as their dispute in the previous Mishnah. As explained there, the Tana Kama defines a sukkah as a temporary type of building, whereas Rabbi Yehuda requires a sukkah to be sturdy and long-lasting. Therefore, a sukkah that can barely support pillows and blankets, which is clearly a weak temporary structure, is considered valid by the Tana Kama and invalid by Rabbi Yehuda. And the Rav does tell us, "Ven Rabbi Yehuda," the Halacha does not follow the opinion of Rabbi Yehuda. That is in Rabotai of today's Mishna Yomi. Baruch Adonai Leolam. Amen v'amen.